Thank you all for having me today. So my presentation today focuses on an archaeological project that I'm currently working on with Acadia National Park and Schoodic Institute. And I'm working with a team of collaborators to address climate change threats to Indigenous archaeological sites, or we like to call them cultural spaces, Indigenous cultural spaces in the park. I want to start by orienting you both geographically and culturally to the research with these two maps. The one on the left shows the National Park Service lands in Maine. There are three primary areas in the region where the National Park Service manages lands and resources. The one in north central Maine is a relatively new national monument called Katahdin Woods and Waters. The one on Maine's eastern border is St. Croix International Historic Site. And the one on Maine's coast is Acadia. And the National Park Service is working really hard to partner with Maine's Indigenous peoples in carrying out their responsibilities relative to these places. The Park Service acknowledges that they're operating within Wabanaki territory, and Wabanaki is a term for the Indigenous peoples of Maine. It translates to people of the dawn or people of first light. And the map on the right shows the location of the 5 Wabanaki communities, and the project that I'm discussing today focuses on the sites and cultural heritage of these communities. So the guiding framework that I use here is an Indigenous archaeology's theoretical framework, which is archaeology conducted with and for Indigenous peoples. And Indigenous archaeology's framework really seeks to empower Indigenous peoples in the archaeological arena. And this means acknowledging Indigenous people's right and authority to make decisions about research and preservation of archaeological sites within particularly their territory. Another characteristic of Indigenous archaeologies is that it supports Indigenous values and agendas. And this is really important in terms of creating a research design. Very often in conventional approaches to archaeology, research questions are generated with little consideration of the needs or interests or values of Indigenous peoples. And for over a century, archaeologists in Maine have really assumed the right to excavate and research and interpret Indigenous archaeological sites and the associated material culture with little to no consultation with the people whose heritage these places represent. And so the project that I'm working on currently seeks to deconstruct these practices and really confront the neglect of Indigenous voices in Maine archaeology. We're attempting to accomplish these things by combining archaeological study and community engagement with the intent of amplifying Indigenous voices in decision-making relative to archaeological sites in Acadia National Park. So one of the problems we have with Indigenous heritage sites is climate change and climate change impacts. And as we all know, loss and damage is a significant problem that's associated with climate change. And loss and damage, as I define it here, really refers to the impacts of climate-related stressors that haven't been or can't be avoided through mitigation and adaptation efforts. And as archaeologists, this is one area where we play an active role, particularly with regard to what's referred to as non-economic loss and damage, which is loss of both material and non-material forms, not commonly traded in the market. And our cultural spaces are an example of this, and often we see the impacts of climate change on our heritage places. And you can see by these images how our cultural spaces are becoming more threatened by what's going on in terms of climate change. With regard to climate change, loss, and damage in Indigenous peoples, we know that Indigenous peoples are particularly vulnerable to climate change impacts, and this is for several reasons. They often live in vulnerable environments, and they're very, Indigenous peoples are often tied to places for a very long time, usually across multiple generations. So they're really rooted in place. Also, the lifeways of Indigenous peoples are often tied to natural resources in intimate ways, and they rely very heavily on local environments for sustenance, ceremony, and their economic systems are often rooted in their homelands or territories. And these situations are compounded by economic, social, and political marginalization, which often interfere, these areas often interfere with their ability to influence change. And so, because of these factors, um, Indigenous peoples are particularly susceptible to threats and changes in their lifeways in loss and damage due to climate change. One area where we see evidence of this here in Maine is with regard to Indigenous heritage sites, and particularly Maine's shell mounds or shell heaps, sometimes referred to as middens. And um, I'm I've tended to veer away from that term because midden assumes or generally uh, connects these spaces with garbaging behavior, and we know that they're much more than that. For Maine's Indigenous communities, coastal shell-bearing sites are really remnants of a built heritage that help to tell the story of our ancestors and our cultural connections to place. Maine is home to roughly 2,000 of these cultural spaces, and they represent roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years of Native American families using the coast and living on the coast. And so these shell heaps are places where past Indigenous peoples deposited large quantities of shell. Often, most of them are clamshell, although we do have some shell-bearing sites in Maine that are comprised largely of oyster shells, and all of them are threatened. Shell heaps along Maine's coast preserve a material and cultural record of past lifeways. Sites along the coast often contain Indigenous forms of material culture, such as bone and stone tools, ceramics, as well as cultural features such as house floors and fire hearths. Because shells act as a preservation agent, bone and plant materials are exceptionally well preserved at these locations. And collectively, these items, plant remains, and features tell the story of Wabanaki lifeways, um, and particularly lifeways prior to European contact. Unfortunately, shell mound sites are exceptionally vulnerable, both in terms of climate change impacts, but also in terms of human generated impacts. You can see here on the top two images, photographs of shell-bearing sites along the coast of Maine that are being washed away, and they're being washed away at a very rapid rate. We also have issues with respect to people developing our coastline and people building houses, um, and all of the infrastructure that goes along with that are also threatening Indigenous heritage sites. We also have the issue of looting that occurs oftentimes in these locations where people will go and dig through the sites searching for artifacts. So despite the important characteristics of coastal archaeological sites and um, uh, their the threats that are on them, they remain marginalized in the context of the general preservation ethic. Preservation interests and funding for preservation is heavily skewed toward the protection of really the post-colonial built heritage. And, you know, if something, if Fort Knox, for example, was threatened by climate change, we'd see much more activity than what we're seeing with regard to the protection of the shell-bearing sites, despite all of the information that they preserve and the stories that they can tell about people living in Maine prior to European contact. So you can see there are a number of issues with regard to shell-midden sites or shell heap sites. And Acadia National Park is one entity in the state working to address climate change threats to these coastal spaces. And they're doing so using an Indigenous archaeology's framework. And in other words, doing it with and for Indigenous communities. So Acadia is home to roughly 24 known Indigenous cultural spaces, also known as archaeological sites. Most are cultural shell mounds threatened by climate change, sea level rise, and human impacts, although um, federal land, fortunately, with our federal land, we have much stricter laws to protect these places and much stricter punishments to folks who loot or try and take artifacts from the park. So we have a little more protection with regard to human impacts. Um, Most of the sites in Acadia range from anywhere from 4,000 years to 500 years old. And really, they all reflect past lifeways of Indigenous families. And again, families is a term that I've started to use more and more often when I'm talking about people living at these places, because oftentimes archaeologists use terms such as inhabitants or occupants, and that tends to dehumanize them, in my opinion. And so I like to remind folks that, you know, these were families living at these locations. They also contain their belongings, their gifts, their creations, art and activity areas. And, you know, I think that for Indigenous people, connecting with those materials is vital in terms of being able to have access to some of the materials that are generated through archaeological inquiry. Several important studies of Acadia's Indigenous heritage sites occurred in the 1970s. And here's an image of one of those archaeologists taking notes at an archaeological site that's no longer there. And in terms of the work that was done, it was very conventional. It was conventional archaeological research, and they were at that time trying to collect information so that they could understand what the climate change impacts were going on. So this has been an effort by the park that's been going on for decades. And we've known of the erosion problems and sea level rise impacts for decades. Through this work, several reports were generated, and Indigenous material culture, of course, was collected and curated at this time. And these early studies serve as the basis for this present study. And we designed a project that actually revisits the materials and archives that were generated during these early studies. And this is, and we intend to generate a body of information that can be reframed and shared with Wabanaki communities. I think it's important to point out that many of these collections have been on shelves in Acadia National Park and been cared for by them and very well. Um, but when my students and I went for the first time to pull these materials to reanalyze them, it occurred to me that I was the first Wabanaki person to touch these materials and to have access to these materials since they were created, some 2,000 years ago. And so that really made me want to um, facilitate connections between contemporary Indigenous peoples and these materials. And while the Acadia has done a wonderful job protecting them, they really, in my opinion, they need to be engaged with again by Wabanaki peoples. And Acadia is really committed, though, to co-managing these places and the materials with the Wabanaki communities. The problem is that information about these places has never been shared with Wabanaki communities. And so several other issues are evident in terms of understanding Acadia's relationship between their work and the Wabanaki communities and archaeological resources. And so understanding of past lifeways in the park has been impeded by other issues as well. And so, for example, there has been a lot of archaeological research in the park since the 1970s. It's been intermittent. There's been very, very limited analysis of the materials that Wabanaki ancestors left behind. And this has really created a gap in knowledge about Maine's Indigenous peoples and Wabanaki connections to Acadia National Park. I think park staff have really been ill-equipped to discuss site contents, and in part because of funding issues and other things to be able to make the connections between these materials and the sites and contemporary communities. And one of the other issues that we're facing is that there's been a real disrupted engagement between these cultural spaces and peoples and practices and contemporary Wabanaki groups. And in part because of land alienation and dispossession and other things. And while there may be knowledges of coastal land use and traditions within the coast, access to archaeological sites has not been available to Indigenous peoples because of land privatization and other things that prohibit Indigenous peoples from engaging with these spaces. So the project that we're working on is designed to use the existing collections as a basis for learning more about pre-colonial Wabanaki relationships with Acadia National Park lands. And there are a couple of goals here. One is, as I mentioned, to address the gaps in knowledge through the analysis of some select cultural materials from a couple of locations in the park. And another goal is to use this information for knowledge exchange and communication with Wabanaki communities and other stakeholders in order to facilitate kind of a co-management kind of approach to addressing climate change threats to Indigenous heritage spaces. And the third goal here is to build skills in archaeological inquiry among Wabanaki interns. So in carrying out this work, we are attempting to indigenize narratives, practices, and decisions related to cultural heritage heritage spaces in the park. And we've identified several common themes in heritage-based work that we're attempting to address. The first theme deals with language in the archaeological narrative. And language, terminology, and values, they all shape and influence how the story of Wabanaki Pass is communicated. So words are value laden. And as I mentioned, the term midden is often linked to refuse deposits or garbaging behavior. And this may not necessarily be an accurate description of what these sites mean to people today or meant to people in the past. And from a Wabanaki perspective, we really view these spaces as so much more than that. They're part and parcel of who we are. And so we're trying not to talk about them wholly in the archaeological sense, although we are all the archaeologists working on this project are all trained in Western science, and so we bring that kind of viewpoint to our analysis and study. However, we try and override that, I guess is a good term, with some indigenous knowledges. The second theme here deals with our positioning within archaeological inquiry. Wabanaki people really have a history of being relegated to the periphery of archaeological study. And this project is intended to put Wabanaki people really at the forefront of the research. And we do this with Wabanaki interns, Wabanaki advisors, and a community engaged focus and motivation. The final theme here centers on alienation. And as I've mentioned, through historical land takings and colonization, Wabanaki people have been alienated from our traditional cultural spaces. And as a result, this has inhibited our understanding of the past, as well as our ability to act as responsible stewards for those spaces, which we view as part of our role as Wabanaki people. And so one of our goals here is to facilitate reconnections between past and present peoples and to reconnect Wabanaki communities to cultural spaces. And before the pandemic, we envisioned having people actually get out to the sites. And I hope that at some point we can do that and the park is open to that. But that's on pause until we can get healthy again as a society. So this project is grounded in really some stable and long-standing relationships that involve multiple advisors and partners. This research is not conducted in a vacuum. The Abbey Museum, for example, has been a major player in decolonizing archaeology for decades. And they have an archaeological advisory committee that's comprised of Wabanaki and non-Wabanaki representatives. And this group really serves as a sounding board and guides our process throughout this approach. All of the Wabanaki Tribal Historic Preservation officers are part of this advisory board and are really important for helping us move through this research in appropriate ways. Additionally, the University of Maine Anthropology department has supported me in this work and gives me quite a bit of autonomy in shaping my research agenda to center community work. And finally, we also have folks, we couldn't do this work without support from the National Park Service and Schoodic Institute as well, who have not only provided funding for the project, but also have participated in the conversations that we're having in order to change the narrative of how they engage with these spaces in the park. So 2 locations were selected for study, and we We selected these materials because they both have sort of robust collections of both materials and records. They were both investigated in the 1970s. We wanted to sample both an offshore site as well as a mainland site, and that way we would have some uh, good sampling of different landforms. That's a typical archaeological approach. They both have very diverse time periods and site types at these locations. And there's some ethnohistoric and historic research that goes along with both of these locations. And we felt that um, uh, the archaeological work would be a nice complement to some of the ethnohistoric and historic research that has gone on in the past and is currently underway. We have two Wabanaki interns who are focusing on material culture analyses, and Isaac St. John is with his Holton Band of Maliseets, and Natalie Dana Lola is Passamaquoddy Penobscot, and they've each started doing research and looking at the materials from um, each of these sites in order to compile information for community distribution. So Fraser Point is generally a soft shell clam site. One of the notable species there that we have remains from is the great auk and sea mink. Both of these are extinct. And so this gives us a great opportunity to think about how people engaged with species that are no longer with us. The site here is being heavily eroded, as it was in the 70s as well. And we know that Fraser Point has been used for roughly 2,000 years, and possibly older. It could, we do have some materials that appear to date to roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years. And so it's an important location. And I think in terms of cultural, a cultural space where people can engage with easily, Fraser Point is one of those. Here are some images from the 1970s excavation at Fraser Point, and you can see the erosion here. You'll note the photo on the left illustrates a shell deposit and site stratigraphy pretty well. The photo on the right is also work being done during the 1970s. But I really want to draw your attention to the quote here, and this is from the report. It says, the constitution of the funnel remains, the lack of features and ceramics, and the remainder of the artifact assemblage imply a temporary habitation emphasizing marine ecosystem exploitation and activities in which non-stem bifaces played an important role. And so, and this is not to disparage Dr. Sanger at all. He was my master's thesis advisor and a great archaeologist, and I learned a lot from him, and I think the world of him. But I wanted to share this quote as an example of the kind of language that needs to be transformed in ways to make it accessible to Wabanaki communities and other communities as well. And I see this as part of our role in the project. And so that Wabanaki people can have the information they need to participate in stewardship conversations around heritage spaces in the park. And we need to get away from archaeology speak if we're going to be effective in that. Natalie is focusing on the Isla Ho location and particularly Duck Harbor cultural spaces. Duck Harbor gets its name because it was a location of molting ducks and they were easy prey for hunters. This site was excavated twice in 1976 and 1978. It was recommended to the National Register of Historic Places, but it was withdrawn because of erosion. It was no longer eligible. There are both pre and post European contact cultural spaces. And at this location, there were both shell and non-shell sites. And one of the unique things about Isle Ho is that it was a quarry location, and we don't have a lot of information on how folks were accessing stone along the coast prior to European contact, but this is one location where it was an important resource available to them. And so we know that folks are taking materials and using materials to create tools, and really it was in thinking about this, very often, we simply think of it as lithic procurement and reduction. Well, these materials help people to survive, and by extension, are their abilities to survive ensured that I am here today as a Wabanaki person. And so there's a lot of meaning that goes into the importance of these places, particularly as people would be able to use these materials in order to live in ways that were sustainable, but also would ensure that there would be future generations to look back. And so I think in terms of a cultural site, Isle Ho is probably one of the most important sites we have on the Maine coast. And I'm thrilled that, we are able to revisit Isle Ho and look at it through a different lens. This photograph on the left was interpreted as a cultural feature, although that's about as much information as we really have on it. And you can see this slope here where the quarry materials were collected from. Our approach to analysis of what are referred to as legacy collections is a blended approach. Remember, we are all trained in conventional archaeological methods, but we're seeking to approach our work in ways that are culturally meaningful. And this is a standard form that we use to record attributes on stone tools in particular, in this case. And you'll note that at the bottom of this sheet, there's a space here for language. And the students are drawing from Wabanaki language terms to describe the materials that they're working with. And this has, initially, I envisioned this piece of the analysis as one where that would help in student language development in terms of Indigenous languages. However, it's turned out to become much more meaningful, because when you begin to look at materials through the lens of an Indigenous language, you begin to see all of the nuances of the culture in their relationship with these materials. And so this has been a really important piece of transforming how archaeological analysis is done for us. And the students are developing a list of terms that, as they go through the analysis, they'll use these terms and draw from this list. And it really does reshape how stone tools and ceramics are described. These are some images of the materials we're focusing on. Again, stone tools, ceramics. And, again, I reiterate that these were locked away for decades with no active role in Wabanaki society. And through this process, we're able to reintegrate these materials into Wabanaki society in a way that is meaningful and may actually help to shape management decisions around these sites. We all, oh, whoops, sorry, I didn't know that was in there. I apologize. We also are working with students at Frontier Institute for Research Sensor Technologies to analyze some of the ceramic residues, the food encrusted residues that exist on ceramic pots in order to understand foodways and how these pots were used. And this is a pretty standard archaeological approach. But I think that the information will be useful to Wabanaki folks as we begin to really think about these pots or these vessels as sustaining people. Excuse me. We have had many opportunities to share our story with others, and to date, most of our outreach has been with non-Indigenous audiences, and that's an important form of outreach that we'll continue to do. But for us, another important, probably the most important contribution of this work is sharing what we can with our communities, and we plan to begin that work in upcoming months, hopefully April, but we're putting together a webinar series that includes information about the sites and materials, but it's also designed to serve as a feedback loop. And so that we can begin to get information on how Wabanaki folks envision the future of cultural heritage sites along the coast, and what where we should focus our priorities in our interests, and how are we going to address the fact that we are losing these places at a very rapid rate. So I just wanted to highlight some lessons that have emerged from this work thus far. And these will likely evolve as the project does, but some important takeaways include the acknowledgement that partnership on archaeological research has matured over time, and that this project is grounded in relationships that span decades. Many of us have been doing this work for a long time. And so I think it's important that to highlight how working on Wabanaki sites with Wabanaki peoples is something that doesn't happen overnight. Another lesson is that Indigenous archaeologists really need space and opportunities to break away from conventions. And as scholars, I think we have an opportunity to create those spaces and acknowledge the value of them. And I think, as we move forward in terms of publications and archaeological research in general, having the opportunity to break away from conventions actually will enhance the discipline in ways that will be beneficial probably for many outside of Wabanaki or Indigenous scholars. The project is about both shared knowledge production and resilience. I think we seek to share knowledge back and forth through these events and activities. But what this work really can do is strengthen Indigenous communities through cultural understanding and cultural connectedness and cultural identity. And if our communities are going to be resilient in the face of climate change, it's going to be our cultures and our cultural traditions and our connections to our ancestors that's going to help strengthen us in that way. Another lesson is that Indigenous heritage materials really need to be freed from rigid curation practices. And we know that in this country, we have millions and millions of artifacts and material culture locked away in places. And for good reason, I think, in many cases. But I do think we need to rethink how we are engaging with those materials and think about doing it a little differently. And finally, again, cultural heritage preservation is essential to supporting community resilience in the face of climate change. So those are the lessons thus far. I wanted to attempt to share with you a video that we've created to showcase the project. It's just a short one, it's about 3 minutes, and we created it as part of the Society for Historical Archaeology's 3-minute climate stories. And I think it really conveys how important these places are to us and this type of work, and the significance of this type of work to those of us who are engaging in it. So I will start this.
Datrinel sol deepen help min good gig with snow. Datrinel sol deepen help min good gig with snow. Shidwam pebotine ma wam kabazotine. What the hell web you ma wam kabazotine. Datrian also deepen help min get me tuck snow. Datrian also deepen help min get me tuck snow. Shidwam pebotine ma wam kabazotine. What the hell web you ma wam kabazotine. Adrian also deepen help min get go come snow. Adrian also deepen help min get go come snow. Chidwam pebotine ma wam kabazotine. What the hell web you ma wam kabazotine. Adrian also deepen help min get for some snow. Adrian also deepen help min get for some snow. Chidwam pebotine ma wam kabazotine. What the hell web you ma wam kabazotine. Adrian also deepen help min get me chano. Adrian also deepen help min get me chano. Chidwam pebotine ma wam kabazotine. Ode web you ma wam kabazotine. Adrian also deepen help min get me.
So with that, there's my credits, and I'm open to questions and comments, and I'll see if I can stop sharing my screen and we can have a conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Newsom. And what a powerful end to your talk with the video there. I'm so glad we got the sound work and that we were able to see that. So yeah, I have gotten lots of questions and comments come in through the chat. I think I'd like to start by asking, just as follow-up, someone's asked if there's a link to that video. I'd also wonder if you can share, like, where can we go for updates when the Wabanaki Community Engagement webinar series, for example, would be ready to launch?
Well, I think the video either will be on or already is on the Schoodic Institute website, or the Acadia National Park website may also have it. It may not be quite up yet, but it will be. In terms of the webinar series, we are awaiting funding on that. So I don't have any information on when that will be happening. Our hope is to start it in April, or begin putting it together. The goal really is to showcase the webinar series during Archaeology Month, which is October here in Maine. And we are targeting the Wabanaki communities with that.
Thank you. And for our audience here, if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. You can send them to me with direct message as well. I do have one question here where Margot Lukens asks, let's see, can you tell us a specific example of how connecting Wabanaki languages with archaeological work on artifacts or flora or fauna can help enrich understanding?
Oh boy, Margot. Okay. I think the students could probably answer that question much better than I can, because they're the ones that are pulling together the words. I think what we found is that the descriptors are much more, for example, the descriptors of stone tools is much more verb oriented than, you know, how we might describe something, or adjective oriented. And so it's about the process of making stone tools as opposed to the object itself. I know there's also words for shell mound. There's also words for the residue, something that is scorched on the pot, and there's actually a word for that. So I'm sorry I don't have more information for you in that regard, but more will be forthcoming. How's that?
Thank you. Another question that's been sent to me is, how do you generate research inquiry questions when you have so many partnerships and probably different interests as those groups come together? And then do any of those inquiries change or questions change as you have findings in your work?
I think for the most part, the questions that we're generating are coming from the Wabanaki perspective. And for example, one of the students really would like to expand on understanding the distribution of the quarry material. And in order to understand how people are connected across the landscape and how people relate to each other across the landscape. And so from her perspective, it's, you know, where were my relatives' relationships at? And, you know, really that is also an archaeological question that is often framed, but archaeologists might term it differently. We may say, you know, what's the distribution of this lithic material across the landscape? I think, you know, we're coming at it from a point of what are the relationships that that distribution represents, you know, and how do my ancestors interact with each other through this type of material?
Mm-hmm. Thanks. It looks like Leonard Cass has asked, can you bring legal action against the US government for not taking sufficient action against climate change since your property and lands are being lost?
You know, I don't know that that's a fight we want to take on. Honestly, we have a lot of challenges, and it's not a laughing matter. We have a lot of challenges with regard to our sovereignty over lands and waters that we didn't think were challenged already. And you know, we can bring. I think the park can bring. You know, can arrest folks for taking artifacts. But in terms of us bringing lawsuits against, you know, the Park Service for what they're doing, for me, that I think we make more headway by working in partnership with them as allies than, kind of bringing lawsuits against them.
Mhm.
Others, may have a different opinion on that, but that's just my opinion. I think we can make a lot of good progress in improving Wabanaki lifeways and Wabanaki situations with, um, uh, partnerships and allies.
Mhm. Yeah, great points and great answers. Um, let's see. Oop, questions popping up fast in the chat now. Just trying to keep track of. Here's one that I had wanted to mention, and that comes from Denise Smitten. Expressed her thanks, first of all, but then mentions, I appreciate so much to think about the use of the word midden. Have you thought of a term one could use more generally? Perhaps in this case, shell mound works.
Yeah, we use shell heap, shell mound, shell bearing site, cultural space, Wabanaki, cultural space, if we really want to get specific. And so those are the kinds of terms that we try and use in place of that. We do have this initiative that Maine and I'm involved in, is the Midden Minders, and that's a really catchy title for that. And that's a citizen science initiative designed to protect and work to measure erosion and all of those things on some of these sites. And we're doing really great work. But again, words are value laden, and I think we use them, and it's okay as long as we acknowledge that there are other ways to describe these spaces, more culturally appropriate ways.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I love that point that words are value laden. That's a good segue to the next question I've gotten from Ildorkar Sandor, who asks, does researching while using Wabanaki language in some ways help with reclaiming of land and culture? And if so, in what ways?
I think in terms of our relationships with, kind of our non-Indigenous partners, it conveys a message it reinforces a message that you are on Indigenous land, and you are, particularly with the Park Service, you are stewards of Indigenous cultural heritage. And having language that can be used in place of some of the more colonial terms starts to break down that traditional archaeological narrative. And so in that way, I think using the language is good. And I think we're going to make some good progress with that piece of the research.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And John Mattis wants to ask next, if you're examining collections in the Abbey Museum that goes back to at least the 1920s.
The Abbey is a big partner in the work that we're doing, and we are well aware of the collections that are curated and cared for by the Abbey Museum. For this project in particular, no, the Abbey's collections are not part of this. We have to wrap up in a year with this project. So, but the Abbey collections are very much on our list of potential resources that we can draw from in order to educate communities about the lifeways of Native peoples in the past, particularly on the coast.
Thanks. I'll go next. This is a great question from Liam Warden, especially around the theme of climate change and women. But he asked if, given the material that survives in shell heaps, what sort of gendered analysis could be or has been done?
Very, very little gendered analysis on the shell heaps. Although I do think that we are beginning to look more closely at domestic space. Gabe Hreineck out of the University of New Brunswick has done a lot of work in looking at domestic space and with regard to things like house floors and features that are organized and how they're organized within them. And I'd recommend reading some of Gabe's work. He's an alum of the University of Maine and is doing some really great archaeological research regarding domestic space and gender.
Then I think to wrap up, I've got one last question here in the chat that I think sounds like a great way to end things. David Hart has expressed, I admire your efforts to help indigenize the University of Maine. What progress have you and your colleagues made, and how can we help?
You know, I've been here since 2017, and I will say that I think we've made some really great progress. Just in that short amount of time, I've seen so many new initiatives to bring Indigenous peoples and archaeology together. And right now I feel like there's a new energy around archaeology at the University of Maine. And part of that is due to community support and partner relationships that we've established. And, you know, again, it's about, you know, building awareness about how threatened these places are. And so I'm really thrilled to be here. I mean, I don't think there's any other place on the planet I would rather work than at the University of Maine, because it's rooted in my homeland, and the archaeology is so rich, and I have such deep connections to it. And I want to share that with students and researchers at UMaine and beyond. But yeah, I think we're doing some really wonderful new things.
Awesome, thanks. And thanks again for being here today. If we've got a couple minutes, someone brought to my attention, there's a few people have hands raised too.
Okay.
I just apologize. I can really only see two things at once on Zoom while facilitating. But yeah, Karen James, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Yep, I just unmuted. Thank you. This is related to, and the reason I raised my hand instead of typing into chat was because it came on the heels of one of the questions you answered and was related to it. The one about using Wabanaki language in the work and whether it actually helps the work. And you talked about indigenizing narratives, practices, and decisions. And I was wondering about place names, especially in Acadia National Park, and whether there's any part of this or other projects related or unrelated that are seeking to bring forward the Wabanaki place names in the park, whether on maps or interpretive signs, or just in terms of education and outreach, perhaps through Abby. And I admit that I'm asking this partly, I live right next to Acadia, and I'm in these places every day, and I realize I'm calling them constantly by their colonized names, and I would personally like to stop doing that if it were possible. So I'm really interested in your answer personally as well.
I think that's a wonderful question, and I think that the National Park Service in general, for all of their spaces, would welcome that. And you know, we as a team, Natalie, Isaac, and I have started to think about, okay, let's see if we can figure out the names of these places in terms of Indigenous language. And we just haven't gotten there yet. It's on our radar that it's something that we want to do. We want to communicate about these places in Indigenous languages as much as possible. In fact, the reason you heard a little bit of language in the presentation is because I pulled it from another presentation that language was part of it, and I didn't include that in this one. But you know, I view integrating Wabanaki language into all aspects of this research, and I think you're right. I think part of not having that contributes to kind of this historic erasure that Indigenous people were not here. You know, and by bringing those terms back, then we're sending a message that yes, this is Indigenous territory, and you know, we've been here for thousands of years, and we can see that in the language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Newsom and Dr. James, for that question as well. We'll go ahead and wrap up. Bonnie, I don't know if you can see the chat. You just got lots of thanks for today's talk. And we so appreciate you being here. I know Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies in particular, we appreciate that you were part of the speaking series. And so we have arranged, it took about 3 or 4 couriers on my part during remote instruction, but if you check your box in Anthropology department, we have a gift for you.
Okay, well, I appreciate that very much. And it wasn't necessary. It's been a real treat to share this research, and I hope, you know, maybe in a year or so, or maybe even sooner than that, I can have some results where we've done a lot of community engagement, and, you know, it's pulled us a little bit away from the analysis, but we're getting through it. And I can't wait to see what the students come up with. I'm really excited about that.
Great. Yeah, again, thanks so much. I look forward to seeing updates as well.
Great. Thank you all.
All right. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Our next talk in the speaking series is in 2 weeks. I believe that's March 18th. So hope to see you there. That is Sada Kahanamoku, who is a native Hawaiian scientist, and she'll be speaking then. So hope to see you there, and have a great Thursday. And thanks again, Dr. Newsom.